Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the floor. Welcome. Welcome to Prague. Welcome to the conference. When we needed to decide what conference to organize, I preferred to organize a conference of experts because I do not like political speeches. By the way, it is me who is opening the conference. That is why I'll be as brief as possible so that we can really start with the experts conference. I'll start with a personal memory of mine. When I was a young boy, my father talked a lot about his childhood and years when he was young. He was the oldest out of 5 children, and when he was 10, he had to leave his home with the family because of the Munich. And for 6 years, the family had been migrating and ended up in the then Czechoslovakia. And what is also interesting, his mother, my grandma, didn't talk much about that time, hardly anything, but sometimes she talked to me about the First World War when she was 13 or 14. They had to flee in the former Yugoslavia, the front of the First World War. Why am I speaking about these events? For 2 reasons. First, these events are not exceptional. I believe that in Europe, and especially in the region of Central Europe, many families have these memories. I believe that Europe is well familiar with the phenomenon of migration. When you look back at your family history, I'm sure that you will find certainly some stories of migration. And in this context, I'm really very sad when I see how quickly some people tend to forget about their personal histories or the history of their relatives who were migrants at some point of time. It is sad to see how quickly we give preference to our own comfort instead of helping someone who was deprived of his rights and who needs help, the same as we needed it some years ago, our families needed it, or maybe the same as we may need it one day, maybe. And the second point is that when I listened to the memories of my family, it was interesting to see that everybody was impacted by these events, and the impact was even stronger when it was a child, because an adult can bear with a lot. We all live complicated lives anyway, and we are able to face many different situations and even sufferings. But when it comes to a child, it is completely a different matter. The child soul is fragile. The time lived by children is different. A year of a child is much longer than a year lived by an adult. And that is why I am convinced that when we speak about migration, we really have to focus on children, and we have to make sure that we do not hurt child's souls. It is because it is our human obligation. And if this is not enough for some, then it is also important for pragmatic reasons. If we do not do it, if we do not make sure that children's souls are not hurt, then in our societies we will have people who are permanently traumatized with all the negative impacts that it will bring. I promise to be brief. I will be brief. I wish every success to the conference, and I hope that this conference will allow us to find the best solutions to replace children detention, because it is something that has no place in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And now, let me give the floor to Christos Giakoumopoulos, Director General of Human Rights and Rule of Law of the Council of Europe. Christos.
Thank you very much. Minister, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is a big honor for me to join Minister Pelikán in opening this conference, which is hosted by the Czech Republic in the framework of the chairmanship of the Czech Republic of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. I would like to extend my thanks to the Minister, but also to the Ministry more generally, in particular Vitchom and his very dedicated team who made this conference possible, thanks to their initiatives, their professionalism, their efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality today is that children make up a striking proportion of the migrant and refugee population in Europe, but also globally. Many of these children are fleeing war, conflict, persecution, discrimination, perhaps poverty or other precarious situations. And on their journey, they are all too often exposed to severe risks of human rights violations, including violence, abuse, exploitation. Now, these children come from different countries. They have behind them different scenario. They have different individual stories for which we may have different levels of sympathy. But they all have at least two things in common. First, they are particularly vulnerable and particularly exposed. And secondly, they need protection and care. They have a right to protection, and our states have a duty to grant this protection. And this is not only a legal obligation, it goes beyond that. Because in a global world, whereas these children are in Prague, in Strasbourg, elsewhere in Europe, in Calais or in Lesbos, these children will make up the future of our societies. And it is their determination, their possible determination to build a world of tolerance, of prosperity and freedom, as opposed to a world who would revert to violence, hate and fear. This is how we would like to shape the future and the destiny of our civilization. The right to freedom and security is at the same time at the basis of human rights. It is at the basis of our civilization, at least since the Habeas Corpus Act. It is central to our civilization. So this conference will ask some fundamental questions about children, that is our future, and about detention and the right to freedom, which is at the basis of human rights. It will ask to what extent normalizing detention or considering that deprivation of liberty can be the rule and not the exception is something that we can live with, or whether it is a major conceptual change for our societies. The conference will ask some fundamental questions: to what extent this practice as such is contrary to international human rights standards. It will ask whether, if at all, detention can be in the best interest of the child. It will ask about the impact of detention on health, well-being, and development of the child, with or without its parents or caregivers. And it will ask also about the dynamic relationship between detention and vulnerability. Crucially also, I hope that this conference will ask what we are going to do about this. How exactly we shall continue moving forward in this field. It will ask about other and better ways to do things. And this is where the alternatives to detention come into play. Developing effective alternatives to immigration detention may, of course, prove a very challenging task on the ground, but we do have some promising examples that show that it is far from being an impossible task. And for children, this is a necessity. But if this necessity is to become a lived reality, we need to enhance, to spread, and to further develop not the principles, not the law, but the practices that the states believe in and want to adopt. The day may indeed come, ladies and gentlemen, when we do not speak about alternatives because the issue of detention will simply not be put, the question of detention will not be raised. But that day has not yet come. So we must understand why this is the case, analyze the risks of this situation, and address the root causes and concerns. So in closing, let me again, on behalf of the Council of Europe, wish you all a warm welcome to this conference and very fruitful discussions during these 2 days, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Director General. And now it's my honor to give the floor to a third distinguished speaker to make a keynote speech of this conference. And the floor will be Commissioner of the Council of Europe for Human Rights, Mr. Nils Muižnieks.
Once again, Minister Pelikán, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me a very good excuse to come to Prague again. It's been too long, and to see so many friends, but also to convene us on such a depressing but important topic. During the last 5.5 years of my mandate, I visited many, many places in which migrant children are held in detention, sometimes with their families, sometimes alone. Sometimes the conditions are a little bit better. Most of the time, they're pretty awful. But the conclusion I always reach is the same, is that a detention center is no place for a child. I've consistently maintained that no children should be subject to detention because of their own or their parents' migration status. Opposition to child migrant detention has also been increasingly voiced by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, UNHCR, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and civil society, which has played a leading role in pushing us to do better. And despite all of our efforts, our collective efforts, detention persists, and my sense is that it may even be becoming more prevalent in the last year or two. And for this reason, I'm very grateful that this conference is being organized, and I think it's a good opportunity to take stock and to see are we really moving forward or not. I wanted to highlight several points. The first was already evoked by Christos Giakoumopoulos. It has to do with the very negative impact of detention on children. Of course, this impact is even more negative when you have substandard conditions, but even when conditions are adequate, and I put adequate in quotation marks, it can lead to anxiety, to fear, to depression, and especially for unaccompanied children, I think it's especially frightening to be locked up in a place where you don't know anybody and you don't know why you're locked up. And even for a very short period of time, you often hear this, for the shortest possible time. Even for very short periods of time, such detention, I think, is quite traumatizing for children. And detention increases the risk everywhere of ill treatment. And in recent years, we've seen many reports by NGOs, by the CPT and others of human rights violations experienced by people in detention, including children in detention. Given the risks involved, it's encouraging that international norms are increasingly going against child detention. This is my second big point, is a trend at the normative level is a good one. The European Court of Human Rights has delivered a number of judgments recently restricting the possibility to detain children and pushing member states to consider alternatives. I would particularly note the judgments against France last year, where the court emphasized the psychological and emotional aggression that children experience in detention, which could amount to violations of Article 3. Now, the court does not call outright for the prohibition of child detention yet. I hope that they will get there. The case law is increasingly reducing the room for maneuver of states in this area. I would also point to the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most important, the most ratified human rights instrument in the world. Now, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has done some excellent work on immigration, detention, and children's rights. And if you look at their jurisprudence over time, it has evolved. They initially didn't take such a categorical stand, but now they're unequivocal in their stand. In 2012, they concluded that, and here I quote, "The detention of a child because of their or their parents' migration status constitutes a child's rights violation and always contravenes the principle of the best interest of the child. In this light, states should expeditiously and completely cease the detention of children on the basis of their immigration status." I don't think it can get much clearer than that. In other words, no detention of children. But despite this unequivocal stand by the foremost body looking at the rights of children, detention of migrant children is making a comeback. And this is my third point. And I think ever since kind of the peak of the migration policy crisis in 2015, 2016, we've seen increasing recourse to detention of migrants in general, including of children. And it's often become automatic. And I think this is highly problematic. I followed with great concern the temporary deprivation of liberty in Greece and Italy, especially just after the hotspots were established. I understand that detention is now applied pretty much automatically in Romania for people who arrive by boat. Hungary is another much criticized example where the detention of children in transit zones is another depressing instance. But it's not just a problem in the south or on the Balkan route. It is much more widespread than that. This year, I expressed concern that Luxembourg extended the maximum period of detention of minor migrants. Last week I was in Luxembourg and I visited a detention facility for migrants. The director is here. He's a very good man, very human rights oriented, and he's not happy with what the legislators have done in Luxembourg. And you're quite struck by what you see when you go into such a facility. You see high fences, barbed wire, and you see a playground. And the discrepancy, the dissonance between a playground and barbed wire fences is quite striking and quite depressing. Belgium is another disheartening example. Used to be an example of good practice, but they have resumed the detention of children in closed facilities, and just last week they began the construction of a new facility for families, and that's quite depressing, this backward movement in some countries. Several other countries are moving towards what they call child-friendly detention centers. I think that's an oxymoron. I think it's impossible to have a child-friendly detention center with playgrounds, toys, child-friendly spaces, and of course, barbed wire. But my fourth point is that there are alternatives. And a lot of very helpful guidance has been put out by a number of different actors, by UNHCR in its options paper. The recent report of the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency is very helpful. The Parliamentary Assembly's work and the work of other colleagues in the Council of Europe, but particularly the work by NGOs in the International Detention Coalition. which has been really path-breaking and shows the way forward. And both research and practice shows that children's rights are much better protected where they're not deprived of liberty. They can lead a much more normal life. They have much better access to education. And it's much better for them in terms of preparing for the next steps in their life, whether it be in their country of origin or their new country. Now, I often encounter criticism about that we have high rates of abscondment, and this is why we need to detain people. But we need to ask, rather, what can we adjust in the use of alternatives to reduce the rates of abscondment? What needs to be improved, rather than throwing out the alternatives altogether? I think we need to be very careful about overselling the possibility of returns. I often talk to politicians and I say, be very careful. It is not so easy to return people if the country of origin doesn't cooperate. Even where you detain them, often the rates of return are quite low. So don't give me this story about returns and how you're going to return everybody. It just doesn't work. We need also to challenge the argument that detention protects children, that it ostensibly protects them from exploitation, from trafficking. And here I think the key is to have strong guardianship systems, not detention. And here the work of Tomáš Boček, I think, is excellent. It was badly needed to draw in attention to this issue of guardianship systems. Now, of course, there are implementation problems in all of the alternatives, but there's also a lot of domestic and international pressure to increase recourse to detention. I was especially dismayed to see the European Commission in March issuing recommendations to member states to ensure that their laws enable detention. It was also depressing to hear in Luxembourg that one of the reasons they extended the maximum detention period for children was pressure from other Schengen states to make sure that it's easier to return people. In such a context, you need a lot of political courage to stand up to this pressure, the domestic pressure, to the pressure from European colleagues who want to roll back protections and increase the recourse to detention. Now let me conclude with a few recommendations. I think we need to pay particular attention to the thousands of migrants across Europe, including children who are detained in substandard conditions. There are some awful detention facilities in various places across Europe, and we need to really focus in on those. Here, the work of the Committee on the Prevention of Torture is absolutely essential. I regularly urge member states to publish the reports, to follow the recommendations, and I think that those are very important to improve the condition of people. But the second point is that not detaining children is the best prevention mechanism for preventing human rights violations against children. It's crucial for governments to set out a roadmap how to stop and reduce detention, to show that this is the aim, publicly, loudly, to commit oneself to ending child detention, and to identify concrete steps to move forward. The third point is that this needs to be a collaborative effort. Governments can't do this alone. We need the assistance of and involvement of international organizations, national human rights institutions, but particularly of civil society. They will help us show the way forward to abolish child detention. Another point is that we need to look at the broader context of migration policy, because detention of children, detention of immigrants happens in this political context of bad migration policy, where now we're increasingly having a focus on preventing departures from countries bordering Europe, but also on enforcing returns, difficult as that may be. And unfortunately, my recent work on family reunification shows that safe and legal routes have largely been cut off to Europe, which means that irregular migration will increase because resettlement and family reunification and other safe and legal routes have increasingly been restricted by member states. And this, of course, increases the risk of child migrant detention. Now, despite the challenges, I think the mere fact that this conference is being held gives rise to some cautious optimism. I want to really thank the organizers, and I hope this optimism is not misplaced, the optimism in the title coming to a close. But for me personally, it's very heartening to be in the same room with so many allies and co-conspirators. Sometimes I feel quite alone. I wish us all luck in this very important task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for delivering this keynote speech.